right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back from fall break. We won't do a what I did on my fall break presentation today. Oh, I wonder if anybody ever did that. Maybe somebody else is old enough to have done that in school. All right, let's see. Got Angel coming in here. All right, looks like that's everybody out of the waiting room. I'll keep an eye on that, but I want to get started here to be respectful of everybody's time, especially since our guest is in the Pacific time zone. So it's really early in the morning for Zach.
It's it's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed out here in California.
Absolutely. All right. Let's see. So housekeeping. I know that you have field trip week next week. My assumption is that you're pretty much gone all week, so we will not have class next week. After today's conversation, I will create, just like I did last week, a simple, fast, easy quiz for you to take. This is the first time I've had to do this, I think, that I remember at least. I've got to submit midterm grades tomorrow. So please look for that quiz. I'll publish it ASAP after we're done here. If you complete that, I'll complete all the grading and get the midterm grades turned in. I don't know if I don't as far as I know, there's no like final bearing of those grades. Obviously, it's just progress. But let's get that done. And again, just like last week, it's going to be real short and sweet. And I'll base it on this conversation that we're about to have. So we've got to have the conversation so I can create the quiz. All right. With that, let me introduce to you a friend of mine who is he's a risk management professional. And probably the first question we'll ask is, what the heck does that mean? Zach Waters is the founder and CEO of Black Swan Risk Management. He's most of you are aware of my shows and the things that I do. Zach has been a guest many times on basically everything that I do, and I really appreciate him for that because what he shares with architects is, I think, first of all, for a lot of architects, is either not top of mind, or is pushed out of mind, or it's simply they don't know what they don't know. And maybe it's a combination of those three, but it's also really important stuff when we start talking about, we started a week ago, I think it was, talking about AIA contract documents. Well, Zach knows AIA contract documents inside and out. He's looking at these things all of the time. So a lot of what Zach does, and I'm going to let him talk about this, and we're going to discuss this, of course, has to do with those contracts. And we talked about liability and those types of things. We'll get into those things in this discussion today. So as I mentioned last week when we were talking with Brian, so Zach, we had Brian McCartney last week as
Nice.
our
Brian's a
speaker.
good dude.
Um, as I mentioned with Brian last week, I want this to be a conversation. I will lead it. Um, Zach and I will kick it off. But if at any point we're talking about something and say, "Hey, I don't understand what that is. I don't know what that is," just raise your hand or blurt it out. I expect that a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about, you don't know much about, right? You probably haven't heard that much about at this point. So I want to make sure, and there's no shame in not knowing whatever it is that we're talking about. So make sure that you blurt it out, you raise your hand, whatever. Get into this conversation, and let's get as much out of this as possible. This is one of those, and Zach and I were talking about it a minute ago. I'm honestly not really sure how to make this relatable to you because it's sort of in a way it's sort of esoteric stuff, um, but let's see if we can figure out a way. I try to tie things to like leases, things that you've experienced. I don't know how we're going to do this, but anything that comes up, any question that you have, just blurt it out. Zach won't. Zach won't abuse you for doing that, and he's mean,
Never. I
but
love it. I
but but
love it.
but join the conversation with us. So I think that's it for housekeeping. Anybody have any questions or concerns before we get started? I guess you should ask that. Anybody not going on a field trip next week and you just really want to hang out and talk about pro practice?
I am not going to the field trip.
Okay. All right. Well, let's connect. I don't know if there's anything we ought to do, but let's connect and if you want to if you want to hang out and talk about pro practice, we can. Um,
Thank you.
yep. Anybody else? Anybody else not going on a field trip? Okay. All right. So Abdallah, we'll talk. Um, yeah, let's jump into it.
Deal.
Zach, thanks for getting up early. You're probably not up early,
Absolutely,
but thanks for joining us
absolutely.
early.
Thank you guys for having me. I have a very good friend that's from Kokomo, Indiana, and she played basketball at Marion, which I believe is in Indianapolis, if
Yep.
I'm
Yep.
not mistaken. I was out. Her family runs a farm in Kokomo, and they do a lot of the tomatoes in Indiana. So,
Yeah.
is it? I have to imagine. Is it kind of cold? I mean, it's October. I know it's our schedule. Is it weird out there yet? Is it weird? Is it cold?
Oh, it's always weird. It's 40. Yeah, we're in the 40s, I think.
Oh man, see,
Lower
it was
40s.
93 degrees out here yesterday. So I when I got in my car this morning, it was still like 75. It's nuts.
Yeah, yeah, we're headed
Um,
the exact opposite direction at this
which
point.
I'm jealous of right now, to be honest. But so thank you for the introduction, Jeff. I Zach Waters. I run Black Swan Risk Management for architects and engineers. It's all we work with. So, and I sit on the board of the Architectural Foundation of San Francisco, which is a program that helps train middle school and high school students who are considering to be in a position that you're in right now, which is to go to school for design of some type. It doesn't, even though we're called the Architectural Foundation, it doesn't delineate just architecture. It can be engineering, it could be construction management, it could be a lot of different things. But it's a very cool program that takes kids who are thinking about a career in something like this, and we give them mentorship, and we give them a high school design competition. And so you actually in high school get to work on a project that will get built, and get to work with an architect or an engineer who is licensed, who will help you and guide you. It's really, really cool. So um, I understand that this might not be on your radar yet, which is totally fine. I also understand that my clients whom I deal with, and this is on their radar, find insurance incredibly boring, incredibly complicated, and it is. And generally, it's kind of viewed like taxes, or maybe even certain parts of medicine where you're like, man, I can't even speak that language. And that's totally okay. We're not expecting you to today. I've got some slides for you that I'll throw up here in a minute. I've got some definitions that we can work through and some claim scenarios, but more than that, I really would love to hear your questions, because if you've got questions, if you think of anything, it will make this conversation way more fun. I've done these slides a bunch of times. I just gave this presentation about a week and a half ago to about 250 folks across the country. And so if that's all we do is go through slides, that's totally okay. But if you've got questions, if you've got conversations that you want to have, that's way more fun for me. So um,
Zach, this may be in your slides, so
mhm,
I'm sorry for jumping the shark, but maybe we should zoom out slightly
mhm,
because I mentioned and you mentioned as well. I mentioned in the introduction Black Swan Risk Management.
mhm.
What what basically what is risk management?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a good place to start. So risk management is just like it sounds. It's managing risk. And what is risk as an architect or a designer or somebody who is working in the design field? It is the likelihood that somebody will sue you for something down the road. It's the likelihood that something on the project will go wrong, and that in our day and age, now more than ever, the way that we hold people accountable when stuff goes wrong is that we bring lawsuits, and um, it's not fun at all. It is time consuming. It is stressful. but it's an unfortunate side of the business. And so whenever I speak to classes like yours, one of the first things I start out with is it's not my intent to scare you at all away from from being a designer, from being an architect. Actually, in the chat, I know we're kind of all off screen, but in the chat, I'm just curious who is interested in becoming a licensed architect in their career? Just put yes or me or something along those lines. If I take these polls a lot. Yep, thumbs up, perfect. Um, who is interested in becoming a licensed architect? And then one more, who is interested in owning a practice someday? So if your path is to become a licensed architect, licensed designer, is that path that I want to go work for somebody, either a small firm or a large firm, or is that path that I want to work from somebody and eventually someday I want to own a firm, I want to run a firm, I want to have my name on the door, because that's always interesting. I'm always looking for people who have that entrepreneurial spirit and are going to start that. But
Yeah.
um,
I think you got a few
yeah,
on each of
perfect.
those.
Yep, Amanda, we got Sophie, Armando. Yes, Tyler, perfect. Um, so risk management. Well, we talk about insurance and risk management, and I talk about them as two separate or two sides of the coin, right? Risk management is managing everything that could go wrong. If we were going to put it into a driving analogy, risk management is using your backup camera, it is driving the speed limit, it is wearing your seatbelt, it is using your turn signal. Those are all things that you do to manage risk. They help in the world keep keep bad things from happening, right? If I wear my seatbelt and I get into a fender bender, I'm not worried about flying through the windshield, right? It's just not going to happen. If I use my backup camera, I can see behind me. I'm not nearly as worried about backing into the car behind me. Insurance is what happens when something does go wrong. It's our financial protection for when something gets out of hand. So again, in a driving analogy, I've gotten into a car accident. Many of us who drive know that it's legal or it's the law to carry insurance, and that insurance is there to pay for either the property damage to your car if that's wrecked, or the liability of you hurting somebody else, crashing into somebody else, causing damage to somebody else. Right. So two sides of the pieces of insurance there. So I love to spend my time on risk management. It's way more fun. Risk management in my typical day looks like reviewing contracts. As Jeff said, it looks like giving presentations like this to many folks, either a large firm by themselves or a lot of small firms gathered together. It's walking through procedures on how to handle a site visit or what type of documents we should retain, how we should communicate with our clients, how we should communicate with the design team, right? We do a lot of that type of stuff. Insurance is purchasing insurance policies, understanding why they're priced the way they are, what the deductibles are, what the limits are. And so that's a little bit more what I have for you today. But again, I'm willing to go in any direction you guys are willing to go in. So
as you were saying this, one thing that came to my mind is that I've told the class my story, and you know the story as well, Zach, but I've told them my story of being sued by the United States of America, right? Um, and when I told them that story, and for those of you that missed it, the firm that I was part of the management team on, one of our clients had ADA violations, and when you have ADA on the construction side, and so when you have ADA violations, and long story short, someone has complained about it, and the government decides to um, penalize you for that, prosecute you for that, you're being sued by the Department of Justice. You're being sued. The subpoena says, all the official stuff says you're being sued by the United States of America, which is pretty cool to frame and hang on your wall afterwards, assuming that you came out of that okay. But long story short, just to recap it, what happened was we had given our AutoCAD files to our client, the developer, They had I guess, a construction department who's basically looking at our designs and our construction documents, looking at buildability, how they're actually going to build this thing. And their job is really to look at those things, to price it, to do all those things, maybe make suggestions or ask questions. Hey, can we do this in a different way? It's easier because of winter or because of material availability or whatever. Um, but they had recently gotten AutoCAD. One of their employees was fascinated by AutoCAD. He loved it. He was embracing it. So this was a long time ago, right? They're embracing AutoCAD for the first time, and many of you are going like, "What the heck?" I mean, not like what's AutoCAD. I know you know what AutoCAD is, but you're embracing things far beyond AutoCAD at this point. But that's where we were. And so he was looking at things and he decided to change a detail without our knowledge, and then basically plotted it on our sheet, which had our stamp and so on and so forth. It went out to the job site. It got constructed that way without our knowledge. And uh, it was a violation of, it was a door threshold problem, as a violation of ADA. We were named in the lawsuit because it was our design. We were eventually dismissed from the lawsuit. And I can tell you the longer version of that I did in class one day. But I think one of the reasons that came to mind is because, as you were talking, Zach, about risk management versus insurance, a risk manager like you would have probably said, hey, don't share your files, or at least don't share your files with the stamp, right? So they can plot it, that way, et cetera. Back in the day.
Yeah.
That would have probably been the risk management side of it.
Yeah.
The insurance side was, hey, how do you cover yourself for these types of things? And then I know you and I have talked about this, and I've heard you present on this before. We decided to fight it. And the insurance company probably said, sign this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Because we're out. We don't. If you're going to fight it, we're out. That's and you can speak to this much more intelligently than I can. But to me, that one particular story brings up the two differences there,
Right.
pretty clearly.
Yeah. No, that's a perfect example. Has anybody heard of the Millennium Tower in San Francisco that's been in the news over the last, 4, 5, 7 years now? It's one of the most famous professional liability cases that we have in the industry right now. It's a condo building in downtown San Francisco that was built in circa 2007. And it was supposed to be, it was a luxury condo building, right? Incredibly nice homes, very, very wealthy people. Joe Montana was a quarterback of the 49ers in the 80s and 90s. Some of the San Francisco Giants lived there. There was a billionaire venture capitalist that owned the penthouse. And we don't see a lot of these days, but the Millennium Tower is very famous because it was an error, right? There was an actual error that caused this building to sink, and now it is sitting in downtown San Francisco. And a lot of that section of downtown San Francisco is built on landfill, unfortunately. And when they did the soils report, the geotechnical engineer is accused of not drilling tight enough together. When they did their report, they were too spread out in their soil samples. And consequently, the building is sinking, I think, somewhere around 18 inches at the moment in one corner. So it's tilting, it's leaning, like Leaning Tower of Pisa, if you will. And it's a great example, one, because it's always in the news. Two, it's exactly what could go wrong, if we design something incorrectly. And on a project of that size, you really have to take a look at like how many people were in the QA QC process, how many people got to look at this and sign off on it and let it go, and it still failed. It's one of the reasons that we don't see this too often anymore. It's not nearly as common as it used to be. With all of our computer programs, we have a lot of oversight, right? We have a lot of ability to kind of catch these mistakes, but they still happen. And so the Millennium Tower was built for $350 million in the 2010s, is in $500 million of litigation to this point. It might be higher than that. So as a total project, we're looking at close to $1 billion right now, getting close to that. And I got to work with a geotechnical engineer who came in to provide the fix, provide a report. We had to negotiate that with Millennium Tower Partners in New York City. And long story short, that didn't work. So those are the types of high profile cases that we, when we're talking about insurance and risk management for architects, that's what we're thinking of. Much more common, much more likely is you're working at a smaller firm of 5 to 10 to 15 people. You are aiding in a project. You've delivered it. You've hired subconsultants, a structural engineer, MEP, maybe a waterproofing consultant, something along those lines. And there's a delay. We're not, we told the homeowner that we would have them in their dream home by October 1st of 2022, and we missed that deadline. And they were planning very much on being in there, and they're getting restless. And they didn't account for the fact that the permitting process and everything that it goes along with construction these days, it just takes longer in a COVID environment and just in general. I don't know if you've ever heard of somebody trying to build in California. I mean, we're multi-years in the permitting process. Actually, I think Elon Musk moved his headquarters from the Bay Area to Texas because he said I could literally get this building built faster than it would be to get it permitted in California. But the likelihood is we miss a deadline. Okay, that's a common claim. And what happens when we miss a deadline? Well, if it's a homeowner, maybe nothing too crazy. Maybe they sold their house and they're in some type of temporary housing waiting to get into their new home. But likely, I mean, it's a delay and it could cause us some problems, and they might allege some type of a suit, and our insurance company might say, okay, well, we will pay $20,000, $50,000 for damages, for basically pain and suffering caused by the delay, right? If it's a delay because our structural engineer missed the calculation, this beautiful home is on a hillside, and we needed to bring in a structural engineer because of the beams and the math required is kind of out of our scope as an architect, and that structural engineer miscalculated, right? And all of a sudden, our beautiful cliffside home is falling off the cliff. Well, now we've got a really big problem, right? We've got to basically rebuild, relocate. We've got to start over, and there's a cost to that, and that cost is going to be picked up by insurance. So that's kind of those are two ends of the spectrum, if you will, of types of claims that we see in our office. But nowadays, delays, everything that comes along with delays, the cost of materials going up, supply chain issues, not being able to get the materials there, right? All of those things are things that we have to factor in that weren't as big a factor even a couple of years ago.
One of the things, and like I said, we started talking about, we're in this section now, or we're sort of maybe wandering in and out of this section now, where we start talking about AIA contract documents.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think by my calculation, the contract docs will be updated again in 2024.
Okay.
I may be off by a year in one direction or the other. But during COVID, I hosted a bunch of Ask the Expert sessions for an ABC and Associated Builders and Contractors
Mm-hmm.
section component. And one of the most popular Ask the Expert sessions was with a group of lawyers that were talking about changes that they expected
Mm-hmm.
to see, basically driven by the COVID experience, and a lot of that
Right.
was delays. What do you think in terms of B101 or any of them? Any new language that's coming out specifically, and that's what they were, that's what these attorneys were really saying, is there's going to be language coming out
Mhm.
to protect the architect, from their perspective. They were talking about
Mhm.
contractors, so they weren't
Yeah.
talking about B101. But same on the architecture side,
Mhm.
protecting an architect, a contractor, an engineer, or whatever against uh, delays and
Mhm.
timelines, supply chain problems, the fact that now I can't get my appliances until March of 2022 or 2023 for my kitchen renovation, all these types of things, new language coming in, which I think will be interesting to see.
Mhm.
Um, how do you word that?
Yeah.
Um,
I'm very curious to see what they do when COVID hit. The two big clauses that we were focused on were one was a force majeure clause,
mhm,
which is a French word that loosely translates to act of God, right?
yep,
And it's much more common for contractors, but it basically says if there is something so far out of our control, if there's an act of God, as we would call it, is the legal term, I can't be held responsible for that, right? I as a designer am not responsible for that. If in February of 2020 we are in the middle of building this project and I am doing site visits and we are getting through and in March we all stop and nobody can go to the site anymore, that's not on me, right? That's not my
right,
fault. And the architect has so much on my slide up here liability and so much exposure because they are often the prime consultant, right? And so that means they are contracted directly with the client and they will sub-consult or subcontract directly with everyone else, with the structural engineer, with the MEP, with the electrical engineer, everybody, right? And what that looks like is a slide we'll get to in a minute. It's called vicarious liability. Vicarious liability is this parent-child liability, right? If 5+ years ago, before you all came of age, if you were in high school and you did something, whether that was you were driving a car, you were 16 years old and you got in an accident, whether that was you caused some type of harm or destruction or something, you wouldn't be held responsible at 16 years old, right? Your parents would, because your parents are vicariously liable for you. They are legally responsible for you. And if something that you do causes harm, it's going to get put back on them. Well, that is vicarious liability in the world of design for the architect is you are responsible for all of your subconsultants, everybody else you hire. And if something goes wrong on their side, you have the legal responsibility to pick up the slack if they can't make it, don't have insurance, have had claims before, so their insurance limits are tapped out, and a lot of those scenarios. And the best example I can give you on this, my biggest client is a ENR top 100 firm out of the Bay Area, at 200 folks. They do about $100 million in revenue every year. And they were building a science building in San Jose near Silicon Valley, and they hired an MEP, a mechanical engineer, plumbing engineer, and that MEP designed the HVAC system, and the HVAC system was not designed correctly. It was actually it was too small and it didn't meet the needs. And I'm not an architect or an engineer, so I couldn't tell you the exact codes or what the violations were, but it was a mistake to the tune of $1.8 million. And sometimes when somebody alleges something like that, it can be very uncomfortable and there's these finger pointing, well, Jeff did it, Jeff's this, he was responsible for this and it's not my fault, and there's a lot of bickering that goes on. This was very civil. This was very much people getting into a room. MEP consultant raises their hand and says, yes, this was our fault, we'll take care of it. The problem came when the client finally decided to bring the claim against them. The claim goes to my architect directly and only solely. the guy, I'm looking at the email, and the email says we allege a mistake of $1.8 million, and we expect my firm, ABC Architects, to pay. And you're like, wow, that is rough. And the reason that is because that's where their contract is. The client is contracted directly with the architect is contracted directly with the MEP. And so that means we have vicarious liability. We need to take care of them. And it's our job. It's kind of like you're sitting at a restaurant and the very, very expensive bill comes and you look at it and you say, I'm going to pass that to Jeff. Jeff, that one's yours right here. I need you to go ahead and take care of that, right? I'm very much hoping that Jeff has his credit cards on him or a good large amount of cash and that he can take care of that. But if he can't, the bill was served to me and I'm the one on the hook for it. So our legal team, part of what I do is working a lot with attorneys, and I work very closely with the attorney on the account. And the legal team passed along that claim to the consultant and said, hey, here's your $1.8 million mistake that you were on the hook for. But we know as risk managers, and I'm doing this, that if for some reason they can't pay, my architect is on the hook for it, right? And that is the cost of doing business in our industry. It is part of what we take on, and it's a really important part to understand as you get out there and are practicing. Because if you're going to go get licensed, if you're going to especially go start your own firm, you will be responsible for your subconsultants, and it's really, really important to vet who you're working with. A great practice would be to find somebody that you know and trust, and that's the person that you want to bring in on most of your projects. But it's not always the case. Sometimes, sometimes the client picks the structural engineer, or sometimes you're working in a project that if you guys are in Indiana and all of a sudden we're working on something in California, maybe you don't know some of the subs out here. So it's not always within our control, but it is something that has caused a lot of problems down the road. So
yeah, in my experience, the best thing that we could ever do, and my experience varies from the design side to the design, build, develop side, and the best thing that we could ever do is build really good teams.
yes,
And sometimes that means, if I spent a lot of time on the build and develop side, that means my framer frames everything, right?
mm-hmm.
Because we've been doing this together for a long time. My plumber, my electrician, that type of thing. And realistically, might need to have a couple depending on volume and things, but same goes on the design side to the engineers, the consultants that you work with.
Mm-hmm.
What about the scenario? And we see this from time to time. We actually talked about this last week, I think. What about the scenario where I might want to say, hey, I want all of the consulting engineers to have contracts directly with the client
Mm-hmm.
rather than with me?
Yep. On smaller projects, it is very doable. It is very common. If you're going to go into high-end residential homes and you're going to build someone's dream home for themselves, it is very realistic and reasonable to ask that client to contract directly with anybody else. My dad actually is building right now in his backyard. He's building an ADU, and he lives on a very interesting piece of property. And my stepmother is not a licensed architect, but graduated with a degree in architecture from Arizona State many years ago. And so they know a lot of people in the design industry, and they brought in an architect, and the architect said, this is a tricky piece of property. You probably want to bring in a geotech. And so they did, and they hired the geotech directly. And then the architect looked and said, we've got some very interesting calculations here. You probably want to bring in a structural engineer. And so they did, and they hired that structural engineer separately. And I'm over here, I do this for a living, and I'm like, wow, you guys are putting there's a lot of people for not a very big project, but I get it, right? We'd rather have too much help than not enough. So in that scenario, where the construction value of this is going to be, a couple $100,000 maybe. The contract is absolutely keep it with the client. It makes it nice and easy, nice and clean. And the only issue there is what we just talked about, which is sometimes if your client is selecting the engineers, then you don't get, you're not being able to pick who you want to work with, and basically you don't get to pick your team. But there's ways to handle that in contract. You could say I have first right of refusal. I can say that I get to pick, but I get to say no to certain structural engineers that the client brings. But it's absolutely a good practice.
What about the liability of coordination? Because no matter
Mhm,
if I have those contracts under me as the architect
mhm.
or the client is holding those contracts, the architect still needs to coordinate.
Correct.
I guess, now that I say that, could you assign the structural engineer to coordinate? I don't know. That wouldn't make much sense, but somebody's got to coordinate. So
Right.
what's the liability look like in terms of the coordination aspect of it?
The coordination aspect of it is one of the biggest areas of liability, and it will fall often in the construction management process. And oftentimes, architects get pulled into being construction managers, but they're not getting paid for it correctly,
Yeah.
and they're not insured for it correctly because construction management uh, is very high liability stuff. We think about it what's called at risk construction management, which is I have the ability to hire and fire folks. I have the ability, I am basically in charge. The client has handed over the reins to me and has trusted me, and I'm handling this going forward. And so I'm acting, in the best interest of the client, create this kind of fiduciary liability where I have to act in the client's best interest. And I've assumed a lot of liability now. I've assumed a lot of responsibility. If you can see that slide that's up right there, liability, the word that just means professional responsibility. I'm legally responsible for something, right? And as an architect, I assume a lot of liability. So the coordination, if we're very careful in our contract and we're very careful in our actions in terms of what we're not doing and we're not saying I don't want to be responsible for hiring and firing. I just want to be able to get the team together, and I just need to be able to get everybody in a room and everybody to sign off and make sure everybody's hitting their deadlines, right? It will often fall on the architects as a prime, but if everybody is contracted separately, that can alleviate, I'd say, like 85-95% of the risk there. Yeah.
How often do you see maybe let's just say that there's an architect that's using the AIA contract document suite,
Mhm.
whatever's applicable to their project.
Uh-huh.
It's probably going to be a handful of them, right?
Sure.
Of the documents that are in use on any given project. How often do you see somebody using a quote unquote good contract?
Mhm.
Right, we've got this covered, we've got this indemnity clause, and blah blah blah
Mhm.
blah blah. And then you mentioned actions, and then they're doing something, and I think it could be what I see a lot is, hey, we've got in here in terms of what we're going to do, in terms of our scope of work and our deliverables, we're going to include this, this, and this. But then an architect will turn around and say, well, okay, we'll give you one more option, or
Mhm.
we'll do one more elevation or rendering or whatever. That's
Mhm.
sort of
Yeah.
fairly benign stuff, seemingly. But I see that a lot where we have, here's the contract, but here's what we're actually saying, doing,
Right.
acting on,
Right.
and enforcing. So how often do you see that, and what's the outcome of things like that?
Man, it's much more, it's very common, unfortunately. And it comes from a really good place in general. I will say
Yeah, yeah, I think it
most
always. Well, no, maybe not
most of
always,
my
but yeah,
architects, they're really focused on making sure the client is happy,
yeah,
right? We want to make sure the client, I mean, depending on, no matter what we're building, we want to make sure this is our name, right? This is our brand. This is our stamp and seal that's going to be on this. And I want to make sure that it gets done right. And I would venture that most folks who are taking this course right now chose this degree and this path because you want to contribute something to the society, and that contribution is going to look like a form of a design, right? A building, a home, a project that I can look at and say, man, I helped with that, right? It's one of the really fun things for me. There's not a lot of, I spent a lot of my job in contention, but it's really fun to look around at my clients' projects and say, hey, I know who built that, right? I'm a huge Cal football fan, UC Berkeley, and when I have my structural engineer um, was a part of the retrofit because there's a fault line that runs through the Memorial Stadium in Berkeley, and so they had to retrofit it in 2011. and I have a picture of them all on the job site, and I've got season tickets for like 18 years, and that's so cool to me. Like that these people that I know made this impact on something that's incredibly important to me, right? So that is very, very cool. In practice, what that looks like is we have an AIA contract that says we will do site visits. Great. How many?
Yeah.
What are we doing on those site visits? What happens if we run out of site visits? How much is future site visits? And site visits in COVID now are even more complicated because we're doing things remotely, right? Like you might be. I have clients doing site visits with a drone. Doing everybody's sitting on a Zoom meeting like this, and we're all looking at footage of an unmanned aircraft. Um, this causes clients a lot of problems from your side, in the marketing and consulting because it eats into profit margins too.
Yeah.
It really is the fastest way to lose money on a project is to keep redesigning for free, keep giving away things for free in hopes that somebody will be happy. And the dark side is if they're not happy, they are likely to bring a lawsuit. They're likely to bring a claim against us, right? And so the best way that you can handle that is hopefully, when you go to work at a firm, you are working with somebody who's been doing this for a very long time. Great architects hit their stride in their 60s, 70s, like there is just so much to this thing. It is
They live that long.
right. Fair enough. But there's so much experience needed. And so what all risk management really is we look at what went wrong and then we try to fix it for next time, right? That's really all this is. All I do is I get exposure to a bunch of different projects. I see what goes wrong, and then we build in procedures to try to prevent that from happening again, to just, mitigate it before it becomes an issue. So if we know that we said these certain things in contract, but that the client is likely to make us redesign for free. That was a big clause that caused people a lot of trouble in 2020. There was a clause written in that basically said, if my bid is more than 15% off, I will redesign for free, right? Well, the cost of materials shot up with all of our supply chain issues, and construction doubled, tripled, quadrupled overnight. Well, everybody is now 15% off, right? This project that we quoted that would cost you $500,000 is more like $1 million, right?
Yeah.
And who has to eat that fee and go back and fix it? The architect. So, to surmise, it's very common. The best way to do that is to understand, to go sit with somebody who has understand what the pitfalls are going to be of this project, right? What is likely to go wrong here? And then let's address it in the contract before we get going. And then let's leave ourselves some wiggle room in the contract. And let's say, if this were to go wrong, then this is how we may handle it, right? If, we're giving you 5 site visits, but if you need more, it's, $150 an hour or something along those lines, right? Whatever that makes sense. So we try to build in fail-safe language to the contract now that allows us to get out of that type of stuff.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really good point too. And the class knows, or at least those that were in class, I think it was last Tuesday we started talking about this. Honestly, teaching on AIA contract documents is not my favorite.
Yeah.
And it's really teaching on the specifics of the language is not my favorite because it will change. And,
Yes.
I firmly believe that 99% of the students in this class will not see an AIA contract document in the wild before they're updated again.
Yeah.
Maybe not even updated twice. I just think that that's the reality for a lot of people going into the profession. But I think the big takeaway here is that, and you made a great point. Hopefully you're working with somebody that has a lot of experience. Too many times I see people signing contracts and they don't know what they say.
Yes.
And I gave the example, I guess it was last week, of on the on the design and build side of handing somebody a contract on it was a small project. I think it was the framer. It was a tenant improvement project. So his contract on that was like to build 2 walls or something. It was
Mhm.
ridiculously small, and the the and we used AIA contract documents all the time. The document that I asked him to sign was like 32 pages long, which was probably about, compared to his contract, was about $100 a page or something,
Mm.
right? It was just ridiculous. And I hand it to him and he looks at it and he's like, for this, you want me to sign this?
Yeah,
Right. And I always
right.
advise everybody, it's like, hey, review this,
Hmm.
hand it to your attorney, have
Hmm.
them review it, whatever. Make sure that you are comfortable with what this says. And he looks at it. He, he goes, this is how much this weighs. He flips through a couple of pages. He lays it begrudgingly. And this is part of that good team as well, right? This is
Right.
someone I had worked with a long time, but he begrudgingly lays it on the hood of his pickup truck, the stereotypical
I love it.
kind of thing, flips to the back, finds the signature page, signs it. And in the back of my mind, I'm going, number one, I hate doing this to this guy.
Hmm.
And number two, I'm going, he has no idea.
Yeah. He has
I
no
could
idea.
have, I could have
Yep.
put in that contract. Of course, I wouldn't have, but I could have put into this contract, you need to have this framed in the next 10 minutes, or you're going to pay for the whole project.
Hmm.
Something ridiculous like that. Um, and my feeling is that there are a lot of people out there that do not know. And so this is the irony, right? I don't like teaching the exact language
Hmm.
of the contracts, but you need to know.
Yeah.
You need to
You.
know what that contract says. And like Zach said, understand the project type. If you're
Right.
designing a museum, a house, a fire station, whatever it is, what could possibly go wrong?
Right.
Are we covering ourselves in this contract?
Right.
And does this contract actually cover the things that we needed to cover? And that's because that's a pitfall that I see. Not
Yeah.
not being on the risk management side, I see that, or we're using the exact same contract language all the time, all the time, all the time. Well, do projects ever change? Do clients ever change? Do sites ever change? These types of things. Um, this is the stuff, whether it's being sued by the United States of America for, who knows how many millions that lawsuit was over the course of, how many projects east of the Mississippi River. Um, or it's like Zach said, it's somebody's dream home. If somebody gets, excuse the expression, but if somebody gets butt hurt, they're going to try to pass that along,
Right.
in
Have
a big
As this
hard
class,
way.
I think you guys are a little young, but has anybody ever heard the show How I Met Your Mother? It's a sitcom that was ran for about 10 years, like circa 2005-ish.
Some
It's
thumbs
a
up.
little before your time, but
There's a lot of thumbs up.
there we go. The one of the characters, Ted Mosby, is an architect. And in the beginning of the show, he's working for somebody. And actually, they show him in his apartment. He's got his drafting table. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure CAD can't. My dad worked for Autodesk in 1998. CAD was a thing then. But anyway,
Yep.
um, he, in somewhere around season 3, 4, 5, he opens up his own practice. And he's nervous. He doesn't want to call clients. And finally, at the end of the show, Robin confronts him and says, "What's up, man? Like, why are you're not you hung the shingle, you got your name on the letterhead and everything, and you're not going after business?" And his response is, "What about the books?" She said, "What?" He said, "Well, there's a story of an architect who went out on his own, and he got commissioned to design a library, and he designed the most beautiful library that you could imagine, right? Gorgeous, just beautiful, like stained glass and, just stunning. But he forgot to account for the weight of the
Weight of the
books.
books.
And books are incredibly heavy. I know we don't really have libraries anymore and so much is online, but books are incredibly heavy. And so the caveat was that the building would sink a couple inches each year and then eventually it would be condemned and there was nothing they could do. right? And he, as a solopreneur, entrepreneur, architect, was very concerned because he didn't have anybody to look over his shoulder and review his work and say, oh, you forgot to account for the weight of the books, right?
Mhm.
If you can just take one piece of advice away from today, it is go find a mentor in your next job. Go find, don't look for a job title, don't look for money quite yet. That stuff will all come to you. Go find somebody who, if you're really, really wanting to get in this and learn this stuff, because there's so much to learn here. You get a lifetime of learning ahead of you. Go find somebody who will share their mistakes with you and be your oversight, be your QA QC, as we call it, your quality assurance, quality control. Every firm should do this in some capacity. If you're new, they're going to have people check your work and things like that. But go find somebody who is willing to take you under their wing and help you, because that will accelerate your career. It will open you up to all of these new experiences. It'll kind of let you figure out project types that you want to work on, specific. There's so many different areas that you can go with that. But that team concept, I think it's so important to have your design team, but within your firm, it is really, really important to feel connected to somebody, because you're going to have so many questions. So many, or hopefully you have so many questions, right? Hopefully you get to work
Yeah,
on stuff that
yeah,
you do.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah. And
um,
you mentioned talking to the clients. It reminded me, and that's one of the things I love to do is share my mistakes and share the mistakes of all the management teams I've ever
mhm,
served on, um, because you can learn from that and
yeah,
hopefully not make the mistakes or have the results, the
right,
negative results at least,
yeah,
that we had. And I worked with a guy one time that I mean, it was like I know this isn't technically correct, but he was like an extreme introvert, which is
mhm,
bizarre because you're working with a client and serving a client. And I get the fact that many of us would much rather be sitting and designing than talking or presenting or something like that. But Zach, you were talking about redesign,
mhm,
right? And we get to a certain point. Hey, we're going to give you three options, or whatever. We're going to select from that. We're going to move forward, and then we get to additional services. Or if you want more redesign, if you want more site visits or whatever, we get into additional services. It's hopefully delineated in
mhm,
the contract. Well, this guy, he didn't like to have those conversations. In fact, he would not have those conversations. So when the client said, "Hey, I'd like to take another look at this part of the project," we're 9 months into this and halfway through the construction documents and far beyond, schematic design at this point, he'd say, "Okay," and he would not say, "Okay, but that gets us into
right,
additional services." It's outlined that way in the contract. So what he's doing is additional services, but he would never identify it, right? And he'd go off and he'd redesign, he'd present it. Well, can we tweak this? Oh, sure, we can do that. And he'd tweak it and he'd go on until the client was happy, right? From a place of like you said, trying to serve the client, trying to make the
mhm,
client happy, and then he would turn around and invoice them for additional services,
mm,
which even though
yep,
it says it in the contract, was a surprise to the client. And I can't tell you what percentage. It was a huge percentage of his projects that at least went through or ended in dispute.
mhm,
And maybe that was in us being sued. Maybe that was some sort of
yeah,
mediation or whatever. Um, but that simple lack of communication, lack of raising your hand, say, "I would love to serve you in this way. I'm more than happy to do it. Our contract says X.
yeah,
So if I do this, it means this. Is that okay? Do you still want to move forward with
right,
this?" Such a simple conversation to have.
right,
And if I had to guess off the top of my head, we lost $150,000, over the course of a couple
Yeah,
of years.
I'm would expect it to be more honestly, because that
Yeah, it might have been
my
more.
my project and my dad's ADU, so they hired this geotechnical engineer. Guy comes out 2 or 3 times. Uh, put a contract together that was like 16 or 18 pages. Did my dad read it? No. Does his son do this for a living? And maybe could he send it to me for free to review it? Yeah, he could, but he didn't. And so I get a call from my dad one random day, and he said, "Hey, this geotechnical engineer is sent us an invoice. I don't know where it came from. I sent him back saying, hey, what does this cover? What are we talking about here? And the response from the geotechnical engineer was not, oh, this covers X, Y, and Z. The response was from the geotechnical engineer's attorney saying, we are demanding that you pay this invoice. And we are citing a clause in the contract, which was very vague. It's something to the effect of the client and the engineer will cooperate on all things, was what they cited. And luckily, I have some good friends that are attorneys in the AE industry. And I called my buddy Steve Litchfield. I was like, Steve, I need you right now. So we got it sorted out for him. Basically, the geotech quit. What it sounded like was that he was so busy, he had so much work as a residential geotechnical engineer in California that he just didn't have time. He would show up, he would do his thing, he would send a bill. He would show up to the next project, do his thing, send a bill, and it wasn't agreed upon. Right? It might have even been in contract that ad services were this dollar amount or whatever it was, but it wasn't communicated. And my dad's really big on communication, so that actually very much happens a lot. So that if another lesson to take away is if you can communicate with clients, you'll make your life so much easier. But
Yeah, yeah,
um,
that's a
do
great
we
point.
do we have questions? I know I've just been up here droning on about all things risk management. Is there anything I can answer for you? Any questions
Um,
that we can talk about?
yeah, what have we confused you with?
Yeah.
What
was
has
this was this useful at all? Or are you just like, oh my God, I'm glad this hour is done. That was
yeah,
so boring.
yeah,
That's fine. Honestly, I get it.
yeah.
I
What
get it.
what
This
surprised you? That's the question I always like
There
to
you go.
ask in the homework. What surprised you about what we're talking about? Anything? Just raise your hand or shout it out. Are you still awake?
Do we lose everybody? We were talking about contracts, Jeff. So Steve and I are teaching a paid contract workshop next month.
Okay, cool.
We just came up with this, and it was because the questions that we get over and over again are on the AI docs,
Mhm.
really just basic terms and conditions, right? Like
Yeah,
understanding basic terms and conditions. Understanding an AIA contract is really important. Understanding too that it's going to get adapted, it's going to get changed. So it's nice to understand the shell, but when we see AIA docs that come across our desk, they've been changed by an attorney, right? And they've
right.
been rewritten to a degree. So you need to know, it's really important to know what the shell looks like with the original and then what the adaptations mean. Um, and we understand that our clients will send us contracts that are not AAA docs and they're not written in our best interest. And sometimes we need to push back on that. But
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, if you have a question or anything that surprised you, just shout it out or raise your hand. Otherwise, Zach and I are just gonna keep talking for
just,
the next 3 hours. Um, but that's one thing we see a lot, or well, that's one thing we see a lot is, especially I think in smaller firms, is hey, we don't use AIA contract documents. We conjured up our own, or
mm-hmm.
hopefully used an attorney to write one.
Yeah.
Um, but I think more often than not, a lot of those examples would benefit from going to the AIA contract doc side.
Yep.
Not to be a shill for AIA contract documents, but listen, there's a lot of resources putting into creating some very good documents there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you
Go ahead, sir.
you said understanding the shell, and that's a really great point. We didn't really
Mm-hmm.
talk about that last week. Is that for this entire AI document suite? And by the way, if you haven't seen it yet in Canvas, I put the AI contract document study guide in there. You need to be going through that because we're gonna have a test on what's
Nice.
in there. Let's see, you have field trip week. next week, so probably the week after that. I'll try to make it as painless as possible, but this is one of the keystones or cornerstones that we have to cover. Um, but the thing that we didn't really talk about last week, I don't think, was that this is sort of a shell. It is. It is. I don't want to use the word template, but you can change these, right?
Yeah.
You can modify these for your use, for your own
Hmm.
use, for this specific project and this client and this,
Yeah.
whatever.
I would argue that they should, in most cases, they should be modified. And this is
Yeah.
so this is kind of interesting, right? Where I think of I think of education and learning in two compartments. I think of it in classroom learning, kind of like we're talking about here, and then there's like practical, like real
Yeah.
world, like this is what it's going to look like. And you might have had that experience already where you learn something in a textbook and then you get out there in the real world and you're like, okay, that was good. That gave me a base, but like
Right.
now I need to really, really apply it. AIA docs, to me, my own opinion, are wonderful. And if you are going to, again, we're talking residential, my clients are going to be the homeowners and they're going to live in this home and they don't have their own contract. They're not a sophisticated client in the sense that they do this on a regular basis and know exactly what to ask. And they're not bringing me a contract to sign. I'm bringing them my contract to sign. AIA doc all the way. Do it. It is well thought out. There are
Yeah.
many people on the AIA doc practice committee that have brought together their wisdom and put together a lot of things in there that are important. My issue with the AIA doc, and this will sound kind of interesting, they're too fair. And what does that mean? Well, if my client is not a a couple who is having their dream home built, if my client is a developer, if my client is a huge public entity, let's just say, they're going to have their own contract. And when they hand over that contract, it's not going to be fair, right? The AIA doc was written, it was kind of like, hey, Jeff, you take care of your side. I'll take care of my side. And, we'll be good, right? Meet in the middle, 50-50. When we get into uh, big projects, what that doc looks like when I send it over to you is, Jeff, you will do everything for me. You will indemnify me. You will hold me harmless. You will pay for everything. You will do all of that, right? And you're like, man, I need to push back on this. So it's written like 90-10 in my favor. And then there's a negotiation process that goes on, right? And you're going to take that 10 and you're going to kind of push it over towards the middle a little bit. Well, the problem we have if we start with the AIA doc and an unadapted, right? Just a straight AIB 101, if you will, is that when we start in the middle and we present it to our client, the way it gets conceded, the givebacks push into our side a little bit. So that's my only issue there, is that I work with wonderful attorneys and they adapt those docs for a living. And oftentimes what we will do with the AIA docs is write them in your favor a little bit more so that we can concede things back in that negotiation process if needed. A great example is a limitation of liability. There are a number of ways to limit your liability, but in contract, one of the most effective tools we have in risk management is the architect will be held harmless and only be held to a dollar amount, will only be responsible for either a factor of this fee. Let's say the fee was $50,000, dollar amount of the fee, or $250,000, whichever is less. And I am limiting my liability at that point. I am not on the hook for $1 million. I'm not on the hook for this undisclosed amount, which could be millions upon millions. I have put a cap on what they can come after me for. That's a great tool, right? It's not necessarily written into the AIA docs, but it's a great thing to add. Now, I'm willing to concede on that a little bit though, right? If my client is like, there's no way I'm giving you limitation liability. Well, could we cap it at insurance proceeds so that they don't come after me personally? Because one of the very dark secrets of being an architect is when you get licensed, you have personal liability with your stamp and seal. They could come after you personally if you are the one that is the one that sealed those documents. So sometimes just capping my personal liability is a great place to go.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different ways to go with that, but on the whole, if you learn the AIA docs, you're going to be head and shoulders above everybody else. I can tell you. I deal with tens or hundreds of designers on a regular basis, and I think many of them wished that they had taken the time to learn those documents earlier in their career, because you're going to have to learn them eventually. And
Yeah.
when you don't want to learn them is when you're going through a dispute, right? You don't want to learn them,
Yeah.
you don't want to learn, you don't want to try to build the airplane as you're falling out of the sky. That's not fun. So,
Yeah. That's a really great point. I never
mhm.
thought about it too much that way, as if they're in the are. And I think we discussed this last week, when as they're revising every 7 years, as they're
Mhm.
revising these documents, they bring all the stakeholders to the table
Yeah,
to make these documents as fair as possible to all parties.
right,
And that's a really great point. If it's, when we get into negotiation, I need to have something to give back,
right.
and still still get to what I need to get out of this negotiation. I was going to ask you, but you sort of answered it as you're talking right there. What is the first thing that, whether it's a developer or whoever it is, what's the first thing they go after in the the B101 or any of the documents when they
What,
say,
what's the first thing that they adapt in their favor?
yeah,
Oftentimes it's the indemnification
yeah,
section. So yeah, there's this indemnify. So to indemnify means to make whole, right? If I crash into you and I damage your car, to indemnify you is to either fix your car or get you a new car, right? I have harmed you in some way and I need to make you whole. Um, Clients like to take that indemnification way over the edge beyond what is reasonable. And so it'll often read with 3 words. It'll often say ABC or client, architect agrees to indemnify, which is fine, hold harmless, which is also fine, and defend ABC client. And that's a huge issue for us in insurance. It's an uninsurable cost. What they're asking for there is they're asking for money for attorney's fees. They want you to pay for their attorney, even if they turn around and sue you. That's a pretty interesting idea. They want money
mm-hmm.
for an attorney so they can pay for an attorney to turn around and sue you. It's like, I don't really feel comfortable doing that. I don't want to pay for your attorney to sue me. If it is my fault and a judge or a jury or an arbitrator or a mediator has found that it is my fault, I will pay for my portion of that. That is fine. That is fair. But me paying up front for you to turn around and sue me when I have not been found at fault for anything, that doesn't make any sense. So that word defend gets thrown in indemnifications a lot, and it causes a lot of problems. And we push back on all these contracts and we end up having to explain why that's not fair. And most of the time, to your point from earlier, people don't read contracts. A lot of contracts that are drafted are the client who is presenting the contract doesn't understand what they are presenting their client, meaning they paid an attorney a good sum of money to create this document.
Oh, I see.
And they don't necessarily know what's in it. They don't know what they're asking for.
Yeah.
And the attorney who's taking a large sum of money to create this says, well, they're paying me a couple grand more. I'm going to throw all the bells and whistles in here. Right. I'm going to throw, talking about making it fair. I'm going to make this so one-sided in their favor so that, if anything does go wrong, they're covered. Well, that causes us problems in negotiations. And I'll tell you who causes us the biggest problems are government entities. I live out in Northern California. I used to live in the Bay Area near UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley has a great architecture program. They also have engineering schools. They have environmental schools. They have landscape architecture school. And in those schools, they teach just like you guys are going through right now, pro practice, and among other things. And they talk about the standard of care, and they talk about liability insurance, and they talk about all these things, and we talk about AIA contracts. When my clients get out of school, go to work, they often get to go do work for UC Berkeley. And there's a whole UC system of 14 UCs up and down California. The UC system contract is so one-sided, it is ridiculous. And I have fought them all the way to the chancellor's office because they put language in there that is not, it's not an AIA contract at all. It is not fair. It is not balanced. They are asking for everything in their favor. Mm-hmm. And my argument to them is do we understand the level of hypocrisy here, right? Do we understand that in your school, on your campus, you are teaching students, just like you guys today, this is what is fair, this is what is reasonable, all of these things. And then the moment that we go to do work for you, you have developed this contract that is so ridiculously unfair. Yeah. And their answer is, thank you for your inquiry, Zach, but we'll not be editing this contract anytime soon. Like, wonderful. So that's kind of that. If we talked earlier about that book classroom learning versus the practical, you'll run into some stuff out there and it just doesn't make sense, unfortunately. But I think we had a question in here, which Dala said, if there's a weather-related like flood or tornado, who will be responsible for material and time loss? That's a great question because down in Florida, about 2 weeks ago, right, we had a hurricane tropical storm that wreaked havoc down there. And I have some friends down there, I have some clients down there, and that is when we mentioned earlier in COVID, the clause that we kept coming up against was force majeure. That is an act of God. That is something that is just unforeseeable. We can't necessarily predict, hurricanes and tropical storms very well, and we'd have to get into the details in terms of like, well, is it a project that we're in the middle of construction and it's torn apart and now we're having to start over? What would cover that? Well, everybody's liability or everybody's insurance would pitch in to cover that. If it's already been built, down in Florida, 2 years ago, year and a half ago, we had a condo collapse. That was brutal. That wasn't, that wasn't an act of God. That was just a building that was under designed, and there were fatalities in that project. What everybody's going to pay there, right? Like that's when something that severe happens, insurance is available, and we didn't really get into exposure, but this idea of exposure is that if there is something so severe that can go wrong, even if you don't have any liability necessarily, it wasn't your fault or your responsibility, your insurance is likely going to chip in and pay because we have to make this person whole. The landscape architect on the Millennium Tower project, their insurance had to pay something. It's not a landscape architecture issue, right? The building is sinking. That has nothing to do with, the statues, the layout, it's not a landscape issue. But they were attached to the project. They have exposure, and so they had to pay something. That's just how it goes. So, any other questions?
Yeah, I know we're right up against time, and
are we okay?
You guys are probably just raring to go to structures right now. So, but if there are any questions, just drop them in the chat, or or
if you want to email me later, you can. I'll put my email address in here. Always happy to field anything.
And like we talked about last week when Brian was on, again, we're gonna, one of the side projects, so to speak, that we're gonna work on is sort of that networking piece, LinkedIn and your personal brand, etc. I would recommend that all of you. And I'm started putting this together. I'm going to put together a cumulative homework assignment where you're walking through setting up a LinkedIn profile if you don't have one already and connecting with people, etc., to start building your network. I would recommend, if you are already on LinkedIn, reach out to Zach, connect with Zach, say, hey, Zach, thanks for talking to our class. Are you willing to connect? That would be a great
100%. I will absolutely connect. Yeah.
I have one question. So you were talking about insurance. So let's say I start working for a firm officially as full time, and they have their own insurance. Could I get my own insurance? Like in the case if I mess up and they blame it all on me, even though I'm new. Mm-hmm. And would it be a good idea to have your own personal insurance?
It's a great question. So the professional liability insurance is going to cover the firm. It's going to cover all employees for the firm. It's going to cover principals, retired principals, anybody that was working for the firm at that time. And so if you started for them, let's just say January 1st of 2023, you worked for them for a year and you were a part of a project you worked on, and that project has a claim against it. What happens with these things, they're years out, right? They happen in 2024, 25, 26. If you were working for that firm for that 1 year, you are covered under their insurance. And so you don't need to go get your own personal insurance. Um, but that's a wonderful question. When you need to go out and buy insurance, when you need to talk to somebody like me, is generally when you're starting a firm. You know, you're going to go hang a shingle. You're going to go start your own deal, and you're generally going to be required to carry insurance by your clients or by the state, depending on who you're working for. So
I'll give you, that is a great question. I'll give you a quick example of that. I know many of you need to drop off, but when I was doing my internship, a lot of what we did was drawing by hand, hand drafting and lettering and all those things. So now you really start to know how old I am. We were doing a tenant improvement project, and I was drafting the floor plans for it. And my lettering was not spectacular at that point. And I had a dimension string, and one of the numbers in that string was an 8. And the way that I wrote that 8, the top circle I made really small. And when it was reproduced in a literal blue line, when it was reproduced, it looked a lot like a 0. And the contractors out there, the framers out there framing, he reads it as a 0, he frames it up. That threw things into a mess, and something didn't work out. It had to be fixed. And so I got called into my boss's office one day. I got a little bit of a stern talking to, because, it was illegible, and it caused this problem, etc. And my boss said, I've got to pay for that mistake. Right. And he wasn't being a jerk about it. And it was a teaching moment, but he was making it very clear. Listen, just writing that 8 to look like a 0 cost, and I don't even know if he told me how much it cost, but it cost, say, $5,000 that he had to pay. He probably didn't even, file an insurance claim over an amount that small, but the liability came to the firm, not to me. It was covered by the firm, but it's also a good lesson that our actions as professionals, and even not licensed professionals yet, they have consequences. So we always, that standard of care that Zach mentioned and everything else that we talk about, we've got to uphold that and be careful. That's not to put the fear of God into you or whatever the saying is. But, you draw, and thankfully you can type now instead of write these things. But an 8 that looks like a 0 can cost money, unfortunately. And but I'm glad you asked that question, because that's a good one for all of you. You're covered by your firms.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very important to know.
Absolutely. All right. You all probably need to go to class. So thank you for this. Look to Canvas here I'd say in the next hour or less. And the quiz will be in there, and I'll talk to you. I'll message you on Canvas about next week.
Awesome.
All right, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, guys.
If you have time to stick around, I'm happy to chat for a minute afterwards. If not, just shoot me an email. Again, I know class is coming up. And Zach, as always, thanks. I appreciate you, buddy.
Thank you, Jeff. Happy to do it. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.